Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be presenting on this topic. Just as a quick, I was introduced already, but I just wanted to mention that, so generally speaking, my research does focus on experiences of belonging. That's something I'm really passionate about. And of course, I'm really excited about this particular project. When I first learned about Art Hives, and of course, when I first visited my first Art Hive after moving to Montreal, I instantly sort of knew there was something special there about them and wanted to very much explore that space as a space of belonging. So I was really grateful to have the opportunity to work with my co-researchers on this project and to be here to talk to you about it today. I'm also very pleased to introduce Janis Timm-Bottos, who's an art therapist and an associate professor at the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. Importantly, though, as well, Janis is actually the founder and director of the International Art Hives Network. And so I will pass things over to Janis to have her say a few words before we get going.
Hi there. It's really a delight to be here today and with you all, and to also present with my colleague. So thank you to CREGÉS for hosting this talk today. This particular qualitative study has really supported my own findings through what I do, which is a long-term sustained practice methodology. And it's really made me a very strong advocate for the creation of arts-based third spaces. So all the photographs you'll see today in this slide presentation comes from our Facebook page of various art hives in Montreal. I also want to mention that midway through this talk, we'll be presenting a survey for you to do while we're speaking. So hopefully you'll take advantage of that because we're just gathering a little bit of information from you today. And just to begin, I wanted to mention that, to invite you to consider a larger context, because that's what I'm going to be presenting to you today is sort of a contextual piece for the study that Darla is going to be sharing with you. And so I wanted to start with the larger context of acknowledging the territorial land that we are all part of here in maybe different parts of the country. So if sometime today you'll take a look at some new facts about the people that lived on the land before us, it would be a good thing to do. For me, I'm talking to you from West Central Florida, where the Paracoxy territory is. So I'm very excited to be here caring for my parents at this time, and also exploring the land that they live on and that I'm inhabiting at this time. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of this talk.
Thank you, Janis. Okay, before we get into the findings and more about the research, I just wanted to give a bit of a background, I suppose, in terms of the topic being considered here, which is, the importance of belonging. So defined as personal involvement in a system or environment, so that a person themselves feels to be an integral part of that system and environment. That really encompasses what belonging means to a lot of people. Essentially, you need to be, feel that you're a fit and be part of something larger than yourself to experience a sense of belonging. It really is a fundamental human need that we all have, of course, and individuals with a greater sense of belonging tend to report being happier, having higher levels of well-being. Belonging is also associated with positive social outcomes, such as larger social circles, enhanced peer support. And because it's such a need that we have, there's also some negative consequences associated with not belonging. So low levels of belonging really have been looked at more recently, I think, and compared to being as dangerous as high blood pressure, as obesity, inactivity, smoking. So that just really sort of emphasizes the need for this in our lives, of course. So in terms of belonging for older adults, a sense of belonging is really a key factor that contributes to the well-being of older adults. It contributes, to the well-being of all of us, but it tends to take on a greater significance. Maintaining social connectedness and deepening relationships often becomes a priority as we age. And when older adults report a strong sense of belonging, they tend to also believe that they have the necessary coping skills to survive in times of crisis, which of course takes on particularly significance in today's world that we're living in at the moment. There are a number of factors affecting belonging, but of course, understanding the relationship between aging and a sense of belonging can be quite complex sometimes. There are, of course, a range of factors that influence the aging experience for us all. But it is apparent that there are certain age-related transitions that, things like going from paid work to retirement, from perhaps being married to widowhood, those types of transitions that tend to occur more often in later life can threaten an older adult's sense of belonging and, of course, increase their vulnerability to social isolation. And of course, while social isolation and loneliness affect people of all ages, older adults may be at greater risk of experiencing social isolation due to a diminution of opportunities to engage in meaningful social interactions and some of those changes that I just spoke about. So life experiences more common in older age, again, such as widowhood, contribute to an increasing number of older adults living alone. And according to a report by the Angus Reid Institute in 2019, living alone puts all individuals, of course, at a disadvantage in terms of social interactions that can contribute to their sense of belonging. And because of increased threats to belonging that are experienced often in old age, researchers have stressed the importance of community involvement for older adults, since, and they particularly looking at opportunities to connect with others, to develop that sense of belonging, and have looked at that as a buffer against loneliness, as a protective factor there. So I probably should have mentioned something about my interest in leisure as well in my introduction, but this is something that I've studied, of course, and teach at Concordia, and have a particular interest in leisure spaces. And of course, what we know about leisure spaces and activities is that they do provide important outlets for social interaction, for connection to others. They can contribute to a sense of belonging. And this is particularly the case often, as we age. And again, things like perhaps leisure spaces replace that sense of belonging that maybe people felt in their work environment, for example, or things of that nature. And so often it is through leisure that, we're seeking some social experiences and connecting with others. And that's often why we do what we do in our leisure time. So community leisure spaces and where people can gather have received some attention for providing that important social infrastructure that supports belonging. Since relationships are likely to grow and be enhanced when people interact regularly with one another while doing things that they enjoy. It is apparent that such community leisure spaces do play an important role in supporting older adults' sense of belonging. And while we tend to know this, and of course, previous research has focused on, some of the more commonly researched social spaces for older adults, such as, community centers, senior centers, perhaps, also places like coffee shops and things of that nature. We don't really yet know, what factors in such spaces really contribute to a sense of belonging. We also haven't looked too much at some different spaces and communities and some of those more unique settings, I think, that have the potential to contribute to belonging. So, again, thinking about that from a perspective of this study, I felt it was, really important to look at a space such as an art hive and what that could contribute in terms of a sense of belonging for individuals, and in particular for older adults. So with that in mind, we set out to explore older adults' experiences of belonging. We looked at 3 different Art Hive locations in Montreal for this study. The 2 of these Art Hives were located in social housing complexes here in Montreal. And the regular participants of those 2 Art Hives typically included, older adults who lived in the complexes, as well as older adults who lived, nearby and could get there easily. The other Art Hive is located in a university-sponsored community storefront. And at the time of the study, this Art Hive was open to everyone most days of the week, but there was a dedicated time each week that was specifically set aside for older adults to attend. So those 3 Art Hives in particular provided, a good context for looking at a sense of belonging from the perspective of older adults. We wanted to know the meanings and experiences of belonging for older adults who participate in each of these 3 Art Hives, and what ways do they feel like this, the Art Hive does create a space where one feels a sense of belonging. So at that, I'm just going to pass things over to Janis for a few minutes to describe in a little bit more detail what Art Hives are all about.
Okay, thank you, Darla. So indeed, Art Hives are free and inclusive community spaces. And this image here is one of the social housing Art Hives. I think that we have 9 social housing Art Hives on our network. And they are incredibly important spaces where people that are living in that neighborhood, in those residencies, can actually gather. Because in many of the social housing complexes, there are spaces, but they're not held with intention necessarily of things that actually happen there. So to have an Art Hive happen weekly or twice a week is a very, very important aspect to the neighbors having an opportunity to meet each other. So this idea of using public home places as a theoretical base for the Art Hives really came about during my doctoral research, where my project was the necessity of public home places in urban revitalization. And this was really an attempt to put the theoretical underpinnings on a project that had been going for several years, that was very successful, that had started collaboratively with a group of artists who were living on the street. They were homeless. So Art Street was a project, and still is, with Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless. And it was Belenki's findings here, where she discusses the public home place, that really was a key piece to understanding why the project worked. Basically, the healthcare organization was seeking ways to keep people anchored once they became housed, because they knew that housing was only one part of ending homelessness. So people needed more. They need each other. And this is really a big problem when there aren't third spaces accessible to people to interact in. So Art Street was provided this public home place that really fed a sense of home when people didn't have a private home, and also essentially started to support this sense of belonging. And since then, and that was in 1994, I've been able to help launch 10 different types of models of third spaces with my team. And of course, a third space, just to remind you, is a place that's located between home and either your work or your school or some other institution that you feel connected to. Other Art Hives besides social housing can be found in storefronts, schools, museums, parks, hospitals, malls. We started one very briefly in the Cavendish Mall. Churches, other nonprofits. Still, other types of Art Hives pop up in different spaces in parks. Mobile units have been used in the area. And of course, now, due to the pandemic, our Art Hives are primarily online. Okay, so one of the earliest findings was that everyone is an expert of their own lives. And this really came across quite vividly in working with people living homeless, especially older adults that had spent a lot of time on the streets. They were the experts on homelessness. The service providers would always wanted to be of incredible help, but oftentimes the expertise from people who were actually living on the streets, there was no way and no place to share that. And so the first Art Hive, which was at that point called a community art studio, was really a place of exchanging knowledge. And that's continued throughout these 25 years, where we really use the Art Hive as a place to bring different people. It's a mixing ground of different people to share their expertise. It's clear that people need to have places to feel their sense of generosity and to build trust with each other over time and to foster, in order to foster the sense of belonging, which is, we know, as Darla was saying, incredibly important. In order to do this, there has to be a level mixing ground. So it has to be a democratic nature where everyone practices being a student and a teacher. This is as important as it was in the very beginning, where we were mixing people who are living homeless with business people in the neighborhoods, in the urban neighborhood, and also of course, the healthcare workers and anyone, the families that would come just to make art. So one of the best ways of doing this is actually being cautious not to over-program whatever it is that you offer. So letting the community decide what matters to them is essential in this whole process. In our first Art Hive in Montreal, older adults said they wanted their own time in the studio together, that they loved meeting with the kids of the neighborhood and other people that would come, but they really, they really wanted to have their own space. So this type of environment is very co-created by the people that enter into that show up, they enter into the process.
Thank you, Janis.
I think you're welcome.
Did we want to launch the survey questions as well, or?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, Karen would have, there we go. Thank you for participating in this. I think we can continue on though, Darla.
Sure. So there's just a couple of questions up. Hopefully everyone can see those on your screen. Just be helpful to get a bit of insight as to, you know, what people who are participating today, who are watching this, know about Art Hives. But I'll continue to talk about the study as you're filling that out, and we can share the results after. Actually, I don't know if I can advance my slide with it on. So maybe I need to leave it. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Interesting. So it seems a majority here are not really knowing about Art Hives, but interested to know more. So there you have it. Okay, so back to the context for this study. As I mentioned, data collection really consisted primarily of participant observation in the Art Hives, arts-based projects, as well as focus groups and individual interviews. Observations generally, you know, focused on, and this was done by me primarily as kind of a newbie to Art Hives and wanting to get a sense of the space, wanting to really understand how the art making and the Art Hive space itself was contributing to participants' experiences of belonging. So I was sort of on the lookout for that happening, and while I visited. So, and after spending time at each of the 3 Art Hives that we're talking about today, I invited interested participants to take part in a focus group that really aimed to explore how their involvement in the Art Hive was contributing to their sense of belonging. Individual interviews happened as well by the request of some participants who, for whom the focus group just wasn't being held at a great time necessarily, and they just preferred to talk to me on their own. I also wanted to mention that while we're speaking today, mostly about the data that was derived from the focus groups and from the interviews, there also was an arts-based component to this study. And for this, we invited participants who were interested to make art either on their own individually or as a group within the Art Hive that depicted a sense of belonging. And this component of the research really provided us with some unexpected results. And we'll talk about a few of the learnings from that particular piece of the research a little bit towards the end of the presentation. But as I mentioned, the findings I want to share with you come pretty much primarily from the data collected, verbally. So just a bit of background on the participants. We had 19 older adults participate in the study in total, again, across 3 different art hives. 16 women and 3 men participated, which from my observations in visiting the 3 art hives generally reflected the gender ratio that I'd seen at art hives most of the time, in these art hives in particular. Most participants were over the age of 65 and either indicated they were retired from work or not working because of a health issue or disability. There were a couple of participants who were still in their 50s and still working, either full-time or part-time. One of the participants I spoke to held a dual role as an Art Hive participant and eventually also became an Art Hive facilitator through her role there. And while we didn't specifically ask, I didn't ask about socioeconomic status when I was conducting the interviews or the focus groups. A number of participants spoke about living alone and living in subsidized housing, which indicated that, for many, they were living on a pretty fixed income. Participants were also pretty diverse in terms of cultural background and languages spoken. So now for what I think is the exciting part of the presentation, that, the analysis of the focus group and interview data really, as well as the observations that, took place within the Art Hive, really illuminated the vital role that Art Hives played in the lives of older adults who regularly attend. And these, I should have mentioned that these participants who I spoke to were regular participants of the Art Hive. They came, and visited these spaces on a weekly basis anyway. So 4 themes were identified through the analysis that really capture how Art Hives are becoming spaces of belonging for older adults. The first theme, of course, the need for social spaces. The second was, being welcomed into what they consider to be a non-judgmental space. The third, coming for more than just the art. And then finally, the idea that this was a shared space, and they really felt that they, played a role in contributing to the creation of the space. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more. So the need for social spaces was evident really when participants spoke about having limited opportunities for social spaces or access to social spaces in their communities, due to a number of barriers related to, financial barriers, barriers related to health, mobility related barriers. So the need for social space, and in this case, the need for the Art Hive, seemed to be particularly high during the winter, of course. A number of people spoke about how in the winter, it's a bit more of a desolate time of year. The quote you see here from Linda, speaking about she really, sort of felt more depressed during the winter and found it more difficult to get out. And she needed, talks about needing something to pick me up. And it really did pick me up and make a difference. Also, in describing her need for something to alleviate social isolation, Sarah, in the second quote you see on the screen there, explained that the Art Hive provided her with a reason to get out and socialize. She talked about isolating herself a little bit more. So this was good for her in the sense that it did get her out. It got her socializing. It got her back to doing art again. Veronique spoke about having a need to get out because she lived alone, and the Art Hive provided that opportunity. Again, she talked about, I'm really glad to have this place that I need to go to. And she stressed that. And I mean, I need to go. I feel like I should be going. I'm alone and I need to get out. Participants also spoke about how the Art Hive has helped to fill voids, a void resulting from loss or life transitions, and help to provide that sort of sense of purpose again, or engagement in the community. So for some participants, the sense of loss came from the loss of a spouse, and they spoke about the Art Hive being a space that helped them recoup after such a loss. For Reggie, in the second quote you see on the screen here, the Art Hive helped to replace a sense of belonging that he experienced while he was still working. He says, I'm not working anymore, and that was a sense of belonging for me. Now that it's gone, I really need, excuse me, I need to, find that somewhere else. And that for him was the Art Hive space that provided that. The need for social spaces, I should add, was also evident when participants, particularly participants who are living in the housing units where the Art Hives were, where two of the Art Hives were, they described that these buildings were otherwise devoid of a sense of community. And there wasn't that, prior to the Art Hive being there really wasn't that social space that helped to bring people in the building together. So they were really appreciative of the fact that now we have somewhere that, helps us socialize with one another, other folks that live in the same building, because otherwise that wasn't happening. So the second theme that I want to talk about, the idea of being welcomed, was really important for participants, and particularly in terms of feeling a sense of belonging. Regularly, participants, describe the space as a space where they felt welcome, and that it provided this assurance that they would be in the company of people, who were happy to see them, who cared about them, and they were guaranteed kind of to see the same people week after week that they got to know over time. So Joan spoke about the, this positive feeling associated with knowing people would be there to welcome her. Each time she came, she said, we're happy to welcome everyone who comes. So even if you don't feel good, you come on a Thursday, and it's great because there's people waiting for you, waiting to greet you. And Joan's sentiments were in keeping with what was observed during Art Hive visits as well. Each time I visited one of the Art Hives, it would be pretty common to see people hugging. Anytime someone walked through the door, of course, the Art Hive facilitator in the space would greet them with a nice warm hug. Participants often were, again, greeting each other by knowing their names and hugging and handshaking and things of that nature. But it was also common, to hear participants speaking about people who weren't there, or their concern for people who weren't there. If someone missed a couple of weeks, that kind of thing, wondering where they were, how they were, if they were ill or something of that nature. So it really also suggested that if people, weren't there one week to the next, they were missed, which I think is an important component of belonging as well. Participants appreciated the atmosphere that was created within the Art Hive, and often described it as, being the sort of a pleasant space to be in. There's always coffee served and snacks served and things like that contributed to the environment. But they, importantly, also described it as a space that was welcoming because they were encouraged, by other participants, and they received that sense of encouragement, which Farah highlights here in the second quote. There's a sense of belonging in this room because we're all working together. And that sense carries out because people get up, they encourage each other. It's a nice feeling here in that sense. I also often heard how a sense of belonging, or sense of comfort, I should say, was created within a space that came from experiencing no expectations around the artwork that they were making or not making, as the case would have it in some, for some folks. But they felt no sense of judgment or expectation related to the art that they were making in the space. So as Sarah, says here, as well as a number of participants spoke really appreciatively about the fact that this was a non-judgmental space. She mentions, I probably feel like I belong there more than other places. It's a great part of it is the social aspect, that there's no expectations. It's nice that I don't feel I'm being judged, and no one's judging when you're there. So that was very much appreciated. While art making, of course, is the main leisure activity that happens within an art hive, some participants also considered art to be more of a vehicle for establishing the social connections and social relationships within the space. So for some, socializing was more of a priority than the making of art. Veronique spoke about how art was, in the social aspect, kind of worked together. They work in tandem. She, speaks about, I enjoy the collaboration. For me, it's the strongest expression of belonging. I don't know if I move more towards the people or more toward the activity, but I think it's both. And then Farah, echoed the sentiment as well, and used a metaphor to capture her sense of belonging. During my conversation with her, I remember pointing to a frame that she really admired within the space, and talked about it. I think being here together, just like a painting has a frame, this frame, the space, is a frame of belonging. Some participants' connection to the Art Hive was not about art at all. I noticed one participant who stood out for me, for example, was often there in the space, sitting, flipping through a magazine. I never once saw this particular lady do any art at all, and often would joke about how, that wasn't her thing. So it wasn't why she was there. She could often be found, with her magazines, but also teasing some of the other participants in a very humorous way. And it became very clear to me after seeing her there several times that this space meant something to her, despite her expressed lack of interest in art, that, it was still a special place for her to be. So acknowledging that the Art Hive is flexible enough to be what people need it to be. I think this quote from Rebecca really, gets that point across. At the Art Hive, it's loose. You can stop whenever you want. You can start whenever. You don't even have to make art. And she observed, that there's often an elderly woman from the residents who comes and does puzzles, week after week. So it really can be the type of space that people needed to be for them. And the final theme to explore, this idea of creating a shared space. It was apparent during focus groups and interviews that participants recognized that they, helped shape the space within the Art Hive and played an integral role in creating that space. With Krista's quote here on the slide, she talked about that sense of shared ownership. She's, I feel like the space belongs to everybody, and we all have to participate in making it a pleasant place. We need to tidy up or whatever, because, we have to make sure that the place is respected. Participants also discussed taking on responsibility for ensuring that, others felt welcome in the space as well. And in the second quote here, Martine is describing, how she actually took it upon herself to go out and purchase toys for children who visited the Art Hive with their, parents or grandparents or what have you. So she wanted to make sure that, she was pretty overjoyed when kids would be in the space, and wanted to make sure they felt welcome to be there as well. Rebecca described seeing a change in one of the Art Hive participants who over time, took on a leadership role within the space. She mentioned initially, he was really quite shy, he was introverted, tentative, wasn't talking to a lot of people, but over time he really opened up. And she says, he started to clean up and started to thank people for showing up, and really take on he took on a leadership role within the space. And I think there are many examples of participants sharing in the creation of space that I saw as well when I visited the Art Hive. So things like, it was not uncommon to see people assuming, responsibility for enlivening the space through music, bringing in some music to play, some music equipment or CDs. Some participants arrived early or stayed late to help with setup. Often took initiative for organizing art supplies, things of that nature. It was also common to see participants, circulating the room with a card for another participant who wasn't there, who was ill or in the hospital, and getting everyone to sign that and send it. So there was really that sense of ownership within the space that was very evident as well. So all of this, I think, leads to a few important insights around the creation of community spaces and community leisure spaces in particular, and how they can, maybe we can start creating more spaces that, that contribute to a sense of belonging. We heard from participants in this study about some of the challenges, related to transportation, related to physical mobility, that can influence their ability to participate in community life. One thing that was particularly evident was the fact that, constructing these spaces, the Art Hive spaces within residential buildings, really did help for a lot of individuals. It helped, relieve transportation and mobility challenges, while simultaneously creating that sense of community within the building as well, which is really, an important thing to have happen. And given the cost, that's, sort of a commonly identified barrier with being in any type of community leisure space. Often the cost can be prohibitive, but Art Hives, really do become more accessible to more people, to a greater number of people, because they're free. There's no charge to enter, which is of course due in part to the materials being recycled or repurposed or donated to the spaces. But there's no charge for people to come, which is of course, it opens it up and makes it a lot more accessible. The accessibility of Art Hives, of course, makes it easier to enter and to get there, but they are, it doesn't just stop there. That in and of itself is unlikely to contribute to that space of belonging, unless, of course, people also feel welcome to be there and feel comfortable, while being there in the space and contributing. So I think that's an important thing to discuss in a little bit greater detail, is that leisure spaces and community spaces don't just automatically become spaces of belonging by being, attending to things like accessibility. There needs to be a level of intention, I think, behind this and behind creating such spaces. So what I think, certainly we learned from this particular study and from what participants shared with us, is that there are a number of different ways that I think we can work to create these types of spaces in other environments as well within the community. So things like extending invitations, to come in, like Art Hive, the doors are wide open. There's often a sign out front welcoming people inside. If people come in for the first time, they're certainly welcome to be there, personally greeted, that sort of thing. So things like that, the offering of hospitality, creating that space where coffee is served, where, people can come just for that, really come in and have a cup of coffee and a snack. And that's the segue to staying a little longer and maybe creating art eventually, if that's not what their initial intention was about. Again, the idea of, learning about people who come in and personally greeting them and creating that environment where they feel like they're part of it goes a long way. And that's what, definitely was seen happening in this study, as well as discovering people's interests and abilities. So knowing, some people obviously are amazing artists, some others don't share that same interest or don't think of themselves as someone who is inclined to do art. So I think it's about also, and what we've seen through the study, is the idea to understand people's interests and abilities and kind of support shared connections based on that within the space as well. So, people that are interested in the same form or medium of art or other such things. So when creating such spaces in the community, I think it's helpful to understand that the value often of a leisure, program or activity or something that's happening within a space such as the Art Hive is not necessarily about the activity itself, but rather the potential, for that space to become a space of belonging, and for that activity that's happening just to be a vehicle for belonging relationships. So I'm going to hand things over to Janis now, just to talk about some other insights that we've discovered through this research as well. Want to take that
Thank you,
over?
Darla. Yeah, that was really helpful to hear that summary from you. Thanks. So, since art hives are designed to encourage self directed, spontaneous creativity and art making, each person decides what they need to make that day to support their well being. This way of working over time has really promoted a strong sense of self determination. Um, so, group projects do bubble up um, frequently in the form of all kinds of different things. Knitting circles, parades happen, initiating garden projects, and even leadership aspects can emerge from people sticking with what matters to them and in relationship with others. And so art exhibits can happen. Certain moments of each one teach one is very common in the studios, and um, and also actually new art hives developing out of this leadership ability. So, what was interesting in our methodological process is that we really were aware that there was a resistance to the research directive of making art about the theme of belonging. And while I'm certain that people were thinking about it and that it was definitely in the air, we got to see how different people worked, I guess, in more vivid ways. So most people seem to choose to work on one project, for many visits until they've completed it. Others may come regularly just to socialize, like Darla mentioned, and also there's a preference, I think, for many people to stick with this unstructured nature of an art hive, that their independence is really accentuated in what they choose to do when they choose to do it. So we were reminded not to underestimate these qualities and to think how to approach the topic in maybe more of a relational way. So seeing that the older adults were not engaging in the research directives, it was wonderful that the facilitators took a lead, suggesting the idea of perhaps making life worlds in boxes. And so this really provided an absolute container to explore an idea that may not have been as obvious as it could have been, I guess, to different people. So there was quite a nice flurry of activity creating these boxes. So this framing, yeah, it totally inspired participants to create these images, which was one way to handle such a, I guess, a research dilemma at the time. But I think that we have a lot more to think about, and hopefully we will be continuing some work in this area to explore how art does add another layer of insight into how and why the art making actually supports a developing sense of belonging in these spaces. Okay, so the images along the bottom are some of the examples of the older adults that were not participating necessarily in the direct research art research question. But you can see that in the end, they contributed their art anyway. I mean, it is also an interesting phenomenon in the art hives where the ideas are presented and people make their decisions on how in which they would like to respond. And so, while there was some thinking that, well, this didn't really belong in the research, in my mind, it absolutely does. And I think you can see that by looking at the images here, that even though someone wasn't making an image directly about a sense of belonging, a tiger family, a school of fish on a rock, the lighthouse with birds in flight. I mean, these are all wonderful sense of the theme that was actually in the air in the studio. So different people add different pieces to each day that are surprising and refreshing. And in this way, full stories are actually manifested over a period of time. So the Art Hive is an incredibly rich and creative haven for studying the importance of topics that we decide together that is important to us. I like this quote. This researcher has spent a lot of time thinking about the infrastructure, social infrastructure of third spaces, and this quote of contact and conversation. And I would like to add, and art making remind us of our common humanity, particularly when they happen recurrently and when they involve shared passions and interests.
Thank you, Janis. So just to wrap things up with a few concluding remarks in relation to the study, that I think it's pretty evident that art hives are prime examples of what Kleinenberg had just spoke about in that quote, that they do support recurrent contact and conversation, where people can be present in these spaces over time. They're spaces that help to ignite shared passions and interests, and help connect to other people who share those similar passions and interests. So I think what's important to note here is that we can really not overlook the contribution of such spaces to belonging, essentially, and particularly in this case, with the emphasis being on supporting belonging for older adults who may otherwise, and many of them mention this, who may otherwise be susceptible to social isolation and to loneliness if they didn't have a space like an art hive to go to. And so we need more of those spaces, quite clearly. And I think that makes a strong point for that. Understanding the ways that older adults experience belonging within these spaces can really help guide the creation of more spaces. So certainly, I think people probably agree if I say we certainly need more art hive spaces would be appreciated, but also more spaces, in general, I think that support a number of different leisure experiences for older adults, to be in community, to be in accessible spaces that are welcoming, that support that connection to others. So we really need and we can look to, I think, some of the findings from this research to really help guide those types of spaces, if that's what we're out to support, which I hope we are. So on that note, I will just end things with a thank you. I'd like to very much obviously thank the participants at each of the art hives who took the time to speak with me during focus groups and during interviews, to thank the art hive facilitators who certainly were very, very helpful in getting this project off the ground and supporting the art-based component of that as well. A big thanks to CREGÉS, who provided some funding for this research to happen. And finally, last but not least, I should say thank you to all of you for being here today and for listening. So thanks very much.